for Seasons at Willow Cottage. Volume 3, Autumn, by Enchanted Tales Hub, September 8th. There's something about the smell of warm pears and cinnamon that makes a house feel like it's holding a secret, like the walls have softened to listen better, like the air itself is waiting for a spoonful. We had gathered a small crate of pears from the tree near the fence line the day before, pale green with speckles, their skin thin and their insides soft from the last of summer's sun. This morning, I peeled them at the kitchen table while the kettle hummed and the windows fogged gently from the simmering pot on the stove. The recipe was barely a recipe at all, just instinct and memory. Pears, sugar, a squeeze of lemon, a small thumb of grated ginger, a stick of cinnamon, and 2 cardamom pods dropped in like secrets. Lynette sat curled on the windowsill, swinging her tiny legs as she watched the steam rise. "It smells like something a grandmother would keep in her pocket," she said, wrinkling her nose. Eleanor just smiled and handed me a clean jar, warm from being washed and dried near the oven. We took turns stirring me with the wooden spoon, Eleanor with her patience, and Lynette, eventually, with a matchstick she claimed worked better for her proportions. The jam thickened slowly, turning glossy and amber-tinted, the way sunset clings to glass. The cottage filled with its scent sweet, slightly sharp, and spiced just enough to make you stop and breathe deeper. When we finally ladled it into the jars and twisted the lids closed, I made toast from a thick slice of crusty bread and spooned a bit on top. One bite, and it was autumn in every way, warm, soft, and gently spiced, like the turning of pages and the hush of leaves outside. Later, I tied small labels on the jars with twine, not for gifting yet, just to line them along the pantry shelf, like little lanterns holding the season inside. September 12th. The day began with mist over the fields, the kind that blurs the edges of everything and makes the world feel hushed and waiting. By mid-morning, the village square was already blooming with bunting and the soft hum of activity, stalls being set up, baskets of vegetables arranged like patchwork quilts, the scent of roasted corn and freshly baked pies drifting through the air. We arrived with a crate of our own jars of spiced pear jam, a loaf of Eleanor's herby bread, and a small bouquet of dried lavender and wheat tied with ribbon. There was music, fiddles and guitars, voices lifted in songs that everyone somehow seemed to know. Children danced between hay bales, cheeks painted with apples or foxes, and the older villagers sat beneath the shade of an oak tree, sipping cider and swapping stories like trading cards. I recognized more faces this time. Familiar nods. Warm smiles. There were games too, bobbing for apples, guessing the weight of the pumpkin, and a pie competition that Eleanor hesitated to enter, but won anyway with her wild blackberry and oat-topped beauty. Her cheeks turned redder than the berries when they handed her a blue ribbon. Later in the afternoon, we sat on a quilt near the edge of the square, eating roasted squash hand pies and sipping warm cider. The air had that early autumn crispness, like something brushing against the skin just to remind you change is coming. The sun dipped low, turning everything gold, the stalls, the leaves, even the laughter. It felt like we were stitched into a story older than any of us, a tradition passed hand to hand like the heirloom tomatoes in the basket at our feet. We left with aching legs and full hearts, the last of the jam sold, the bread gone, and a few extra apples tucked into our bags. The cottage smelled like festival dust and baked sugar when we returned, and we let the day settle around us like a favorite old sweater, warm, worn, and worth keeping close. September 25th. The rain began just after noon, tapping lightly on the cottage windows like a gentle reminder to stay in. The sky turned soft and gray, and the world outside blurred behind a veil of drizzle. It was the kind of day that didn't ask for much, only a kettle, a cozy sweater, and something warm from the oven. Eleanor arrived in the late afternoon with a basket tucked under her arm and cheeks flushed from the chill. "I thought you might be in need of something sweet," she said, already unlacing her boots at the door. Inside the basket, beneath a folded cloth, was a small round chestnut cake, golden, slightly cracked on top, and still warm. The scent of roasted chestnuts filled the kitchen almost instantly, earthy, nutty, with the faintest whisper of vanilla. We brewed a strong pot of tea with dried leaves from the pantry, mixing it with a bit of milk and honey. The mugs fogged as we carried them to the table by the window, where the outside looked like a watercolor painting muted trees, rippling puddles, the last of the marigolds bending in the rain. Lynette joined us, curled up in the middle of the windowsill with her own thimble-sized cup. She nibbled crumbs off her fingertips and gave the cake a sleepy, satisfied nod. The cake was soft, slightly sweet with the chestnut's natural creaminess and a delicate hint of cinnamon. Eleanor explained how it was made: ground chestnut flour, a touch of brown sugar, eggs, butter, and just enough orange zest to brighten it. No icing, just a dusting of powdered sugar like the first frost. We talked softly over second slices of the market, the upcoming pumpkin days, and a book I found tucked behind the pantry jars, an old gardening journal from a woman who once lived here. Outside, the rain didn't let up, but inside everything felt lit from within, golden, warm, and gently held. Later, we sat in the living room with thick socks and patchwork quilts, the last crumbs of cake on our plates and the sound of water running through the downspouts. It felt like a lullaby of a day, slow and small, the kind that stays with you longer than you expect. October 10th. There's something about the morning of October that feels like a quiet bell ringing in your chest, crisp air, the scent of fallen leaves, and that unmistakable sense of seasonal shift. We pulled on wool socks and jackets and set out early, the sun just stretching over the fields, mist curling low and soft like breath. The pumpkin farm was nestled just outside the village, past winding lanes flanked with hedgerows and russet-colored trees. A handwritten sign hung on the gate, "Patch and Pies, open for harvest," swinging gently in the breeze. The field was a mosaic of orange, fat round pumpkins, squat and striped ones, others with twisted stems and pale skins. Wheelbarrows waited by the entrance, and Eleanor immediately claimed the squeakiest one. We spent a good hour wandering the rows, hands brushing rough pumpkin skins, checking for firmness and the perfect color. The dirt clung to our boots and laughter bubbled easily as we tried to guess the weight of each find. Eventually, We settled on one medium-sized, a perfect deep orange with a proud little curl in its stem. Inside the barn shop, the shelves were lined with jars of cinnamon apple butter, spiced nuts, beeswax candles, and pie crusts waiting to be filled. We bought a few treats for later and shared warm cider donuts dusted in sugar, licking sweet crumbs off our fingertips while sitting on a bale of hay. We returned to the cottage, and the pumpkin sat proudly on the stoop, a cheerful herald of the month to come. Eleanor started tucking tiny scarves around its stem, and Lynette insisted it needed a name, something noble like Sir Butternut of the Patch. But eventually, the chill in the air hinted that it was time to warm ourselves from the inside out. So today, we made soup. The pumpkin's flesh was firm and sweet, and we carefully scooped out its seeds, Lynette sorting through them with great ceremony for roasting later. Eleanor hummed a soft tune while slicing onions and garlic, the scent already promising something delicious. We sautéed the aromatics in a knob of butter until golden, added chopped pumpkin and a handful of carrots for extra sweetness. A few sprigs of thyme from the windowsill pot, a pinch of smoked paprika, and a splash of cream came later, all bubbling in a heavy-bottomed pot that warmed the entire kitchen. While it simmered, we set the table, old chipped bowls, mismatched spoons, thick slices of crusty bread from the village market, and a pat of herbed butter wrapped in wax paper. Lynette fluttered by with a single red maple leaf, which she placed at the center for aesthetic, she said solemnly. We ladled the soup into bowls. It was thick and velvety, with a deep, comforting flavor that tasted like falling leaves and golden light. The cream swirled into patterns as we stirred, and each spoonful was like a cozy embrace. We sat in comfortable silence, steam rising before us, cheeks warm. The last light of the day caught the empty pumpkin shell by the sink, now scrubbed clean and waiting to become something else. Maybe a lantern, maybe a bowl for bread rolls. But for now, it had fulfilled its destiny. And we, with full bellies and quiet hearts, were grateful. October 27th. The fair had been marked on the village notice board for weeks, October 27th, just days before Halloween. As the date approached, the whole village seemed to buzz with quiet anticipation. Even the air changed brisker, sharper, with that unmistakable scent of cinnamon, firewood, and fallen leaves underfoot. We arrived just after lunch, scarves wrapped snug, cheeks already flushed from the walk. The fair was set up in the village green, little wooden stalls strung with golden bunting and paper lanterns shaped like pumpkins and moons. The sound of fiddles drifted through the crisp air, and everywhere we turned, there was something warm, sweet, or wonderful. Eleanor bought a jar of honey steeped with thyme from an elderly beekeeper, and I found myself lured by a table selling secondhand books with cracked spines and notes in the margins. Lynette, after sneaking a few candied apples while invisible, declared the popcorn stand her favorite, not for the popcorn, but for the warm copper kettle and its hypnotic stirrings. There was a small harvest exhibition, enormous marrows, knobbly pumpkins, baskets of windfall apples polished to a shine. One woman demonstrated how to weave straw into tiny animals, and another sold hand-knit gloves dyed with walnut shells and berries. By late afternoon, The sun dipped behind the woods, casting long shadows and painting everything in amber. We gathered near the bonfire at the center of the green, clutching warm paper cups of spiced cider, listening to a local band play folk songs that made your feet tap and your heart ache just a little. As night crept in, children in makeshift costumes began to appear, tiny ghosts and ragged witches, cats and owls with paper masks. Someone began handing out small lanterns carved from turnips, flickering gently in the dark. We walked home by lantern light, hands full of little treasures and hearts quietly full. The world smelled of wood smoke and cider and possibility. October 31st. The morning was fog-swept and hushed, as if even the trees were holding their breath. Halloween had arrived. At Willow Cottage, it wasn't a grand affair, no loud music or inflatable ghosts, but something gentler, stitched with stories, candlelight, and just a touch of mischief. We started the day with baking. Eleanor kneaded dough for little honey oat biscuits shaped like owls and moons, while I carved a squat pumpkin from the farm, not scary, but smiling wide and slightly wonky. Lynette insisted on making her own decoration, a thimble-sized paper ghost she suspended from a string and danced across the windowsill. By dusk, the cottage transformed. Candles flickered in every room, casting long shadows that wobbled on the walls. We placed tiny lanterns and Lynette's paper ghost along the mossy steps, where a bowl of wrapped sweets waited for any brave children who might wander up the lane. After dinner, hearty potato stew with buttery scones, we gathered by the hearth. Eleanor read aloud from an old volume of ghost stories we'd picked up at the autumn fair, her voice rising and falling like wine through the trees. Outside, wind rattled the dry leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl sent delicious shivers down our spines. After some time, we got few knocks on door, one from 6-year Dracula, one from 10-year-old Superman, and 3 5-year-old minions. After every kid had their treat, cottage became quiet again. We 3 sat near fireplace and drank hot chocolate, watching the last embers curl into the chimney, grateful for warmth, laughter, and the feeling that something just a little strange and a little wonderful might always linger at Willow Cottage. November 11th. The wind had changed. It no longer carried the scent of leaves, but something sharper, a whisper of frost, the promise of longer nights. November was deepening, and the cottage, ever old and thoughtful, seemed to creak in agreement. It was time to prepare. We began with the windows. Eleanor fetched her box of beeswax cloths and linen strips, while I pressed the old wooden frames gently shut. We sealed each window with care, tucking the cloth into corners, smoothing folds like wrapping a parcel for the season ahead. It felt like tucking the house in for its winter sleep. The pantry was our next mission. It had grown cluttered over the summer, half-used jars, forgotten bags of dried fruit, a little chaos among the order. We wiped down the shelves, reorganized the grains and pulses, lined up the jars of jam by color: strawberry, peach, plum, and spiced pear. Lynette helped too, or at least she said she was. Mostly, she rode on the back of the broom as I swept or shouted advice from the top shelf, where she had built a hammock out of twine and a mitten thumb. When we found a jar of wildflower honey nearly empty, she claimed it as her winter store and vanished it into her hidden cupboard with a grin. By afternoon, the cottage felt ready, as if it had sighed and settled deeper into the earth. We lit a fire early, even though it wasn't strictly needed, just to watch the flames. The warmth was different now, less about comfort, more about survival. A steady flame, a full pantry, sealed windows. We were bracing gently, not with fear, but with quiet respect for the season to come. Outside, the sky turned pale lavender as the sun slipped early behind the hills. Inside, everything smelled faintly of wax, cinnamon, and ashwood. The kind of scent that stays with you long after winter has passed. November 22nd. The morning began gray and still, as if the sky were made of soft wool. A perfect day for staying in, rolling up sleeves, and letting the kitchen fill with quiet purpose. It was bread-making day. We had planned for it, jars of flour brought out to room temperature, yeast set blooming in a little bowl of warm water and sugar. Eleanor tied on her apron with its faded red stripes, and I followed suit, the familiar ritual grounding us both. The old ceramic mixing bowl stood ready like it had every year, a gift from her grandmother, now part of the rhythm of our seasons. We started with a basic dough, but not a plain one. To the usual mix, we added roasted garlic mashed with butter, thyme leaves from the last of the herb bundles, and a handful of grated cheese. The scent hit immediately, rich and earthy, like autumn had settled into the dough itself. There was something meditative about it, the stretch and fold, the gentle dusting of flour, the quiet patience. The dough grew soft and elastic beneath our hands. Even Lynette, perched on a flour tin with a spoon longer than she was tall, got into the spirit. She insisted on making a tiny loaf for herself, shaped like a pine cone and tucked into a walnut shell for proofing. We didn't question it. While the dough rose by the stove, we sipped warm cider. The kitchen smelled alive, the promise of something wonderful in the making. Later, the loaves baked to golden perfection, their crusts crackling and warm. We split one open while it was still steaming, slathered thick slices with salted butter, and didn't speak for several minutes except for a shared, blissful sigh. The flavor was like warmth itself, cozy, savory, a hug in the form of food. It felt ancient, the act of bread making, something people had done forever. Then Eleanor noticed something. She cracked open the kitchen window to shake out a dish towel and paused mid-motion. "Come look," she called. Her voice was calm but laced with wonder, like someone pointing at a deer in the woods. We gathered by the window in slippers and sweaters. Outside, the world had turned to lace. Snowflakes floated gently, dusting the garden, the steps, the hedges. The air held its breath. Even the trees stood still, dressed in delicate white like they didn't want to move and disturb it. We bundled up quickly, excitedly, and stepped outside into the quiet. The first crunch of boots on snow always feels sacred. The world was muted, only the sound of our laughter and Lynette's tiny, delighted squeals rising above the hush. She danced across the fence top like a leaf caught in the wind, arms wide, balancing perfectly. We didn't stay out long, just long enough to walk through the orchard path, touch the frost-laced branches, and catch snowflakes on our mittens. By the time we came back, our cheeks were pink. Later, we sat curled by the hearth, watching the flakes fall steady and slow, wrapping the cottage in softness. The world beyond seemed far away. Inside, everything was glowing: the fire, the lamps, the faces of those gathered. The snow didn't need to say anything grand. It just arrived and quietly turned everything new.